So now it's time to look at what's really the last piece of the puzzle when it comes to developing for the web. We've looked at how we can use HTML and CSS to style our content, and then we've used JavaScript and jQuery to make our pages interactive and functional within the browser. Then we looked at PHP to see how we could run code on the server side. And finally, what we need is a database to allow us to store details of our users or our content or whatever we want on our website that's going to be updated regularly. And we're going to be doing this with MySQL. SQL stands for Server Query Language, and there are various different types of SQL out there. We're going to be using MySQL because it's completely free, it's open source, and it's extremely widely used. It's also available very simply on the web hosting that comes with the course, and also if you've installed your own Apache server. So it's well worth learning. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to set up a MySQL database on EcoWeb hosting. Obviously, if you're using a different host, or if you've installed Apache on your own machine, you can follow their instructions to set up the database. So I'm going to be working on completewebdevelopercourse.com. So if you want to set this up and follow along, it's ecowebhosting.co.uk/cp/list domains. That will get a list of all your domain names. If you haven't set any up yet, then go to the hosting setup section of this course and do that first. And then when we click on the domain name here, that will take us to the cPanel where we can do a lot of things, but specifically we can set up databases. So here we go. I'm going to scroll down to Web Tools, and you can see the first option inside Web Tools there is MySQL Databases. And here we are. All we need to do is put in a username. So let's pretend we want to create a database to store our users. So I might call this a users database. And then I'll click Create. And that's it. We've got our database up and running. If I then scroll down, you can see that it's created this database here, but the database username is not what I put in. This is because the username is changed depending on what server it's running on. So this one's running on CL29. And also, to keep databases separate, a random 3-character string is added on the end there. That also increases security because your database name is harder to guess. Also, make a note of the database password, which will be displayed just the once when you've created your database. We'll need that to connect to the database in the next lecture. The password is case sensitive. All right, so that's set up our database. Let's see how we can manage our database in order to add some tables and some content. You get taken over to PHP MyAdmin. So this is a very common database interaction tool, and it's pretty good as well. I use it all the time. So we've got some information about our database server, versions, etc. over on the right, password options and appearances in the middle, but really what we want to do is click on the database itself that we want to work with. So I'm going to click there over on the left, and then because this is an empty database, there are no tables in it, my only option is to create a table. So the simplest way to think about a database is that it is a collection of tables, and each table could be imagined to be more or less an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of rows and columns. So if I want to store a bunch of users, I might want to create a table or a spreadsheet with the name users. Unlike an Excel spreadsheet though, I need to specify how many columns I want my table to have. I can change this later on, but I think I want to store an email address, a password, and an ID number for each of my users. So I'm going to put in 3 columns there. All right. So now I need to describe each of my columns and tell the database what type of variable they're going to contain. So I'm going to start off with my ID number. Now it's a very, very good idea to have an ID number in all of your tables. So it should really be the first thing that you put in every time. Not only does it make it easy to find a particular record, but it also actually makes your database more efficient and faster when it comes to finding information in it. So we'll call it ID. It's going to be an integer. So just a whole number there. I don't need to specify any length on values. I don't need to give it a default value. I'm going to miss out those bits there. But what I do want to have is I want to set this as the primary key. And then the database knows that this number is going to be a unique key that we can use to refer to a particular row. And then I'm going to click AI, which is short for auto increment. And that essentially just means it'll add 1 to the ID each time we add a new user, which is a very useful feature. So we don't need to set the ID number manually ourselves. Okay, so now we've got our ID number. We're going to have our email address, which I'll call email. And this time we don't want an integer because it's not a number. I'm going to use a text type there. You can see we've got lots of different types of column, similar to the types of variable that we have, but many more. We're going to look at several of those later on in this section, but I'm just going to go for text for my email field. Finally, we're going to have password as well, and that's going to be text too. We don't need to set default values for any of these, or indeed change any of these more complex options at all. We can add some comments if we want, but I'm just going to leave that blank and then click save. And that will then create our table right here. And you can see there's a number of things that we can do with that table. We can browse the data in it. We can change the structure, so we could add or remove columns or change the types of certain columns, etc. We can search it, we can insert data into it, we can make it empty, or we can drop it or delete it completely. So as we don't have any data yet, let's insert something first of all, and then we'll have a quick browse before we go on to connecting to our database with the PHP script in the next video. So let's add an email address. I'll go for rob@robpercival.co.uk, and then I'm going to very securely use my password as a password. And then we just click go, and then it runs this SQL, which we won't look into in that much detail right now, but we'll be writing stuff like this in just a couple of videos' time. You can possibly imagine what this does. It says insert into, and then there's the database name and the table name. And then we've got the 3 column names and then the values for each of those names. So we've got null for ID because that's auto increment, so it's going to be created by itself. And then we've got rob@robpercival.co.uk for the email and my password for the password. And you can see that's been successful because we've got a tick up there. Great. So now that we've added a row to our table, let's just browse and have a look. And you can see now we've got the table itself with an item in it. So it's got an ID of 1 because it's the first one. It's got the email there and it's got the password. So that's pretty much all we're going to look at here. One very quick word on passwords is that you should never store your users' passwords in plain text like I'm doing here. This is very bad because if you get hacked and someone gets access to your database, then they can see all of your users' passwords. So they would be able to access their accounts on your system. But more significantly, because people use the same password for many different accounts, they might well be able to access their PayPal account or even their Twitter account and take control over it. So I'll show you how to properly store passwords later on in this section, but for now, we're just concentrating on how databases work. So there we go. Feel free to have a click around PHPMyAdmin and see what else you can do. But essentially what we've got is a database, is a set of tables, each of which can be thought of as more or less an Excel spreadsheet with columns, in this case ID, email and password, and then rows with particular values in this case an ID of 1, email of rob@robpercival.co.uk, and then password of my password. And then we can have as many of these as we like, and we can search them, we can update them, we can do whatever we like with them. So databases are extremely powerful, they're absolutely critical to web development. But of course, we don't want to just work with our database in PHPMyAdmin. We want it to run on our website. And to do that, we need to use a server language, and we're going to do that with PHP. So we'll see how to connect to our database. So it's all well and good being able to create and manage our database through PHPMyAdmin. But to be able to do anything useful with it, we need to be able to connect to it with a PHP script. And that's what we're going to do in this video. So I'm going to go back over to FireFTP and create a new folder or directory. And I'm going to call this 7 MySQL. There we go. And then within that folder, I'm going to create a new file, which will be index.php. And that will be what we'll be working with for most of this section. So I'm going to use Command O or Control O in Windows to open that up in brackets. And then I should be able to access that page at completewebdevelopercourse.com/content/7-MySQL. There we go, that looks promising. We've got a blank page so far. Let's just add a quick bit of content here and refresh just to make sure we're all linked up. We are indeed. Wonderful. So the main challenge for this video is to connect using PHP to our database. And that's actually pretty straightforward. We create some new PHP code in the same way that we're used to. And then there's just a single command to connect to a database. And that is MySQL I_connect. The I there is short for improved. And some of you may have worked with databases before or searched online and seen MySQL_connect like that. That's a very popular way to connect to a database, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it. It's officially deprecated now, which means it's not supported, and it's certainly not as secure as MySQL I_connect. If you want to learn more about the differences and why you should use this version rather than just MySQL Connect, then have a quick Google. MySQL versus MySQL I, something like that will give you all the reasons in detail why you should use this version. But if you've never seen this before, then just consider this the best way to connect to a MySQL database. It's worth noting that there is a third way to connect to a database called PDO. And again, if you're interested in these things, feel free to have a Google and check out PDO. But I'm going to go for MySQL I because it's secure, it's supported, and it's much easier to use, I think, than PDO. All right, so we have to pass 3 variables to the MySQL I connect function. And the first one is the server name of our database. Now, because I'm running this script on completewebdevelopercourse.com and I set up my database on completewebdevelopercourse.com as well, I can use what's called localhost. And this is a general keyword that you can use to refer to the server that's running your scripts. You'll also be able to use localhost if you're working with an Apache server on your own machine. If for some reason though your database is on a different server to the script that you're trying to connect to, you can still connect to it, but you need to use the server IP address, which is this one here. So in my case, it's 79.170.44.125. So I would just replace that with the IP address. However, if you are running it on the same server, I would definitely recommend using localhost because the IP address can in some cases change. So I would only use the IP address if you absolutely have to. All right, so that's the server that we want to connect to. Next, we need to give the database username. So that's the whole of this thing here. So cl29-users-bzh. You should put whatever you've got here when you created your database. And finally, of course, we need the password, which is, in my case, that. I may well have changed that password by the time you're watching this video, so don't try and connect to this database. It might not work. You should definitely connect to your own. All right, so that's it. What happens then when we run that script? Absolutely nothing. That's because it's connected to the database, but we haven't told it to do anything with that connection. So it's obviously very useful to know in our script whether or not that connection was successful. And if it's not, then we should give an error message of some sort to the user. So there's a built-in MySQL I connect error function, which will be empty if there's no error, but will contain an error if there is one. So let's echo that for the moment, and let's generate an error by misspelling localhost and putting an E on the end. Let's see what we get. Okay, so you can see we've got an error there. get address info failed. So it's trying to get the address info for the server and it's failing because it doesn't exist. If I correct that, then the message goes away. So that's pretty much it. Just a very quick challenge for you then. Can you change this code so that instead of just echoing the error, we have an if statement that says if the connection was successful, tell the user it was successful. If it wasn't, tell the user that it wasn't. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. It's pretty straightforward. We just need an if statement, and then we're going to put that in itself in the if statement, because remember I said it was empty if the connection was successful. So if there is an error, then we should echo there was an error connecting to the database. You should never echo the error itself on a public website because that may give away details as to what you're trying to connect to, which is never good. If there is no error though, that means it's been successful. So again, we'd never actually display this to the user, but for now, we'll just say database connection successful. All right, let's take a look. Wonderful. We're now connected to the database and ready to create some interactive data storing websites. In order to do that, of course, we've got to be able to take data from the database and be able to edit and update that data. And that's what we'll do in the next few videos. The first thing we're going to do then, once we've connected to this database, is retrieve some data from it. So you'll remember that I've saved just one piece of data in this database, that is my email address and password. So we're going to try and get that back from the database and display it in our script. The first thing I'm going to do is change this code slightly so that it doesn't display anything if the database connection was successful, but if the database connection wasn't successful, the script actually stops. And we can do that using the die command, which feels a bit harsh, but to be honest, if we can't do a database connection, then there's no point doing anything else. So we should always have a clause that if the connection fails, the script just stops. All right. The second bit of preparation that we need is to assign a variable to our database connection so that we can refer to it later on. And normally we call that variable link. But you can call it whatever you like, but link is pretty standard. All right. The first step then in querying our database is to create a query. And this is where MySQL comes in. So anything between these two quotes will not be in PHP, it will be in MySQL. So we're learning a whole new language here. But don't worry, it's pretty straightforward. So if we want to select everything from the users table within our database, then we would just say select. And our symbol for everything in SQL is star. So this means select everything from, and then the table name, which is users. And that's it. That's our way of saying select everything from our users table. Notice the capitalization there. It's not necessary. This code will work fine without it, but it is conventional that with MySQL, you capitalize the standard MySQL keywords, and that just makes the whole thing easier to read. But if you experiment, you'll find that that works just as well. It's just not as easy or as conventional to read as with the capitalization. Right, so that's all we need from our SQL side. We just need to now run the query using our link connection to this database. And we do that in a few steps. So step one is to actually do the query. And we do this using MySQL I underscore query. And then we give the database connection that we want to do the query over. So in this case, link. And then we give the query itself. So I've called that query. And that will do the query, but it won't actually return the results. So the way we'd normally use this would be to put an if statement around it to check to see whether it's been successful. So if that works, it will return true. So for now, we can say query was successful. And just before we run that, I need to add the database name to the MySQLi connect command up here. So on the Eco web hosting servers, as on many web hosts, the database name and the database username are the same. So I'm just going to copy that part and put it at the end there. And this is the database name. If you're using a different web host or a different system, then you should check to see whether the database username and name are different. All right, let's have a look then. We'll run this and query was successful. Fantastic. So that's all well and good, but we want to actually get the data back from that query. So how do we do that? Well, first we assign a variable to the result of the MySQLi query, and normally we call that result. So now we can use the variable result to refer to this query, and if it was successful, then we can get the results from it. And we do that using MySQLi fetch array, like that. And then we say that we want to fetch the array associated with this query or this result. And normally that will be a row of the database. So we normally call that row, like that. Okay, so let's print out that array. Remember, print R is print a readable version of an array. And there we go. So our first real proof that we have connected to that database, we've got our data back in the form of an associative array with the ID, email, and password. Notice that each variable there can be accessed in two different ways. Might be slightly clearer if I look at the source. So you can use 0, 1, and 2 to refer to the ID, email, and password, or you can use, probably more usefully, their variable names, so ID, email, and password. All right, very quick challenge then, just to show that you know how to use that array. Can you make it so that instead of displaying the contents of the array, it says your email is, and then robert.robertsford.co.uk, and your password is, and then my password. Go for it. All right, that should have been fairly straightforward. Two different ways to do it, of course. So we could say your email is, and then we're taking the row array and using email, and your password is, and then we want the password field in the array as well. And we're obviously appending that in the usual way with periods or full stops. Take a look. There we go. Wonderful. And you could also have done it using the numbered fields, although not 0. That would have got you the ID, 1 and 2. And that will do exactly the same thing. All right, that's as far as we're going to go in this video. There's a lot more that you can do with querying. Obviously, being able to select everything from the database is not what you want to do most of the time. But we're going to take a quick break from querying, and we're going to see how to add and update data in a database, and then we'll look at more advanced queries to select the data that we want, and also to loop through if we get multiple results. Now that we've seen how to retrieve data from a database, let's see how we add it in. So you would use this, for example, if someone's signing up to your website. Once they've signed up successfully, you'll want to add their username and their password to your database so that they can log in later on as well. So we do this in a similar way to how we retrieved the data. We start off with a query, and then we're going to write some MySQL, and that's going to insert the data that we need. So as before, it's fairly straightforward SQL. It's insert into. So we're obviously inserting some data into a table. And then the table that we want to insert into is users. And then we put the names of the fields that we want to insert values into. And then we have a pair of parentheses. And inside these parentheses, we're going to put the names of the fields that we want to include values for. So those two fields for us are email and password. Now you can just leave them like that, but it's a good habit to get into to surround them with those quotes there. It's essentially an acute accent, and for me it's next to the Z key on my keyboard. It's not quite a quote, but it's what we used to contain the names of fields in MySQL, and we also use it to contain the names of tables if you want to. Again, that will work with or without, but it is a good habit to get into. And then we put the values that we want to have for them. And again, these are in parentheses, but for values, we use the normal single quotes. So I've already signed up to this. So let's have Kirsten at kirstenpercival.co.uk as our next user. So I'm putting her in single quotes there. And then let's give her a decent password. There we go. She's much more secure than I am. So that's our query. That's our SQL. And then to run that query, we do it in the same way that we did before. So MySQL I_query, and then link and query. All right, that won't return anything in itself other than a success, but we will be able to see in PHPMyAdmin that it's been added. So let's just save that and run it. And the results will be exactly the same because this code that we've got here only returns the first item. We'll see how to return more than one item in the next video. So let's jump back into PHPMyAdmin to see if this really has worked. A quick way to get there, if you know the IP address of your database, is to start typing the IP address. So for us, it's 79.170.44.125 and then /phpMyAdmin. And then that will take you straight to PHPMyAdmin. And from there, you can enter the username and password for the database itself. And that will get you in. Okay. So fingers crossed, we now have a new item of data in our users table. And there it is. Fantastic. So let's just add one more item. So let's put Tommy in here. He can be at gmail.com. And we'll give him probably the sort of password that he'll go for when he grows up. So let's refresh that. And there we go. So now we've got 3 items in our database. What if we want to update some of these? So say someone wants to change their email address or change their password. Well, that's actually pretty straightforward as well. So I'm just going to comment out that query to leave it in there, but we don't want to add those every time we run the script. So let's have a new query. And this is going to be an update query. So say we want to update my email address to something else, then we can have update and then the table name contained by the acute accents there. So we want to update the users table and we want to set the email to, and then let's say I change my email address to robpercival80@gmail.com. Now, if I ran that query, that would update the email address of all of these to robpercival80@gmail.com, which is something we obviously do not want to do. And it's a very dangerous sort of a query to have, because if you code it wrong, you could lose all the data in your database. So we want to set a where instruction, which limits which rows of the table will be updated. So you can see my ID is 1. So we can limit that to where ID is equal to 1. That will only update the users table for my particular row. And what I like doing is something that is kind of an extra safety net, that whenever you're doing an update, you should always put a limit at the end. And what that does is simply limits the number of rows that it will update. So if you're only expecting one user to be updated, then put limit 1 at the end. And that just saves you from writing a piece of bad code or making a mistake, which then updates the whole of your database and loses you a bunch of data, which is definitely something you want to avoid. All right, so let's have a look. Okay, you can see that actually worked straight away, because that first result that's returned been changed from rob@robpercival.co.uk to robpercival80@gmail.com. But if we have a look in the database on phpMyAdmin as well, you can see that that's updated there. Great. Here's a mini challenge for you then. Can you change my password to something rather more secure than that, but instead of using the ID in the where, I'd like you to use my email address. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. So let's just get rid of all of this. Obviously the first bit stays the same, update users, and this time we want to set the password equal to, and then let's just pick some random string. There we go. In single quotes, of course. And we want to do that this time where email is equal to, and then robpercival80@gmail.com. And because this is a string, we need to put it in single quotes. When we had ID equals 1, 1 is not a string here, it's stored as an integer, so we didn't need quotes. But for a string, you do. And just to be safe, we'll pop limit 1 on the end. Okay, let's take a look. Brilliant. That's updated the password as well. Great. So that's how we insert and update data in our database. In the next video, we'll see how we can return more than one result from a query, and also how we can do more advanced queries that allow us to select particular columns from our database and to be more fussy about the sort of users that get. Great. So now we know how to insert items into our database and how to update them once they're there. What we're now going to look at is how to return more than one item from our database, and how we can do some fancy select queries, so we can select users in a number of different ways. All right, so first off, let's just update our output here so we're getting the whole of the information in the row. And then we actually only need to change a very small part of this. We just add in a while loop, and this is then a container for our row, like that. So each time we run the command MySQL fetch array, we're actually fetching a new row. So if we run it several times, we'll get all of the rows that have been selected by this query. So in our case, we should get 3 rows, i.e. all the rows in the table. So let's have a look. There we go. Let's have a look at the output. You can see we've got these 3 arrays here. We do have an undefined query. Oh, there we go. Because I didn't get rid of my query there. There we go. Okay, so that's now returned everything in the database, and we could do something with that data if we wanted to, either display it to the user or update it, or even delete it if we wanted to. So how do we become a bit more selective about what we're querying from the database? Well, we actually do it in exactly the same way that we updated the data in the previous video, and that is with a where clause at the end. And what we might want to do then, for example, we might want to get the users with ID equal to 1. What would that return? Pretty easy. It would return the user with an ID of 1, i.e. me. So let's change that to search for Kirsten's user by email address. We just put email equals and then put our email address in quotes like that, and that will then return just Kirsten. There we go. We can do a lot more than that though. So what if we wanted to return all the users whose email was at gmail.com? Well, that's actually pretty easy. We change our equal sign to a like keyword, and then if we leave that as it is, that actually will return the same thing because it's searching for where email address is like Kirsten at kirstenpercival.co.uk. But the advantage of using like means that we can put a variety of symbols in our query. For example, the % symbol. And the % symbol in MySQL essentially means anything. So if I put the % symbol and then gmail.com, this essentially means select everything from the users table where the email ends in gmail.com, i.e. it's something and then gmail.com. So this should return me and Tommy. There we go. So here's a mini challenge for you. Can you return everyone in our database who has a P, the letter P, anywhere in their email address? Go for it. Hope you managed it. It's just a matter of putting % and then P and then another %. So this just means anything and then a P and then anything else. So it essentially looks for the letter P anywhere in the email address. So that returns me and Kirsten, but not Tommy. We can also use greater than or less than symbols. So if we wanted to return everyone whose ID was 2 or more, then we could use select star from users where ID is greater than or equal to 2. And that should return Kirsten and Tommy. There we go. We can also return just a single column. So say that we know we only needed the email address, then it's a bit wasteful to return all this other information as well. So we could just put email inside these acute accents there, and then that would just return the email address. That's a rather more efficient way of dealing with databases if you know what you're going to need in advance. We can also combine where clauses. So let's say if we wanted to find everyone with an ID of greater than or equal to 2 with a T in their email address, then we would put an AND statement there, and then %T, %, and I have put a capital T on purpose there to show you that we're case insensitive here. So none of these have got a capital T, but they have got little t's, and therefore they're returned. If I change that to a G, then we should just get Tommy returned because Kirsten doesn't have a G in her email address. So I think you get the idea. To our table, and I'm going to do that in phpMyAdmin. So I'm going to click structure and then add 1 columns at the end of table, go, and the column I'm going to add is name, and that's going to be a text field. There we go. So now let's browse, and I'm going to just double click there to update my name, And for some reason, I've decided to refer to myself as Rob O'Grady. Feel free to search for that name online to see if I've been using it anywhere. But really what I'm interested in is, of course, that it has that single quote in it. So if now I wanted to select the user with the name Rob O'Grady, I might start off storing the name in a variable, and then I might put it in double quotes like that to save me from having to escape the character by putting a backslash in front of it there. So now, can you update the query string so it returns the users who have a name of Rob O'Grady using this variable name? Go for it. Did you manage it? It was a bit of a trick, but what I was expecting you to do was keeping that part of the query and then changing the where clause to where name equals, and then in single quotes we have the name. So I'm using my concatenating full stop or period there to bring the name variable into the string, and it's inside these single quotes. So that looks like it should work, but if we save it and run it, you'll see we don't get any response at all. And that's because what MySQL is interpreting the name string as is Rob O and then a single quote. So that single quote is interpreted by MySQL as ending this string. So it says it starts with the single quote and then it ends after Rob O. In fact, if we just echo out the query, you'll see that in a bit more detail. So it starts with select email from users where name equals, and then this Rob O is interpreted as a single string, and then the Grady on the end is just another strange word as far as MySQL is concerned, and then there's another single quote there. So this is not a valid piece of MySQL, so it's not processed by the database. There is, however, an easy fix to this, and that is we can use the function mysqli underscore real underscore escape underscore string. So it's a bit of a beast, but it's well named because it escapes any nasty characters that might cause problems in our code. So we actually have to put the database link in there as well, as with our other MySQLi functions. But what this will essentially do is add backslashes where necessary to escape potentially corrupting characters that are going to break our SQL. So let's have a look now. If we run that, it returns fine. So as a general rule of thumb, whenever you're putting a variable into a MySQL string, I would recommend just always escaping it using that function. There's another even more important reason to escape your strings, and that is if there's any chance that the user can edit that string. If you don't use this function, then the user could pretty easily get access to your whole database by putting in a malicious string, which is designed to end your query and start a new one, which could, for example, select everything in your database and extract all your users' data. These are called SQL injection strings. And if you want to find out more about that and how you protect your website from them, then just have a Google of SQL injections. But a very good protection is simply to use this whenever you are taking a variable and putting it into a MySQL string. Then you won't go too far wrong. All right, I'm going to set you a quick challenge then to put all of this together and try and do it without referring back if you possibly can. The idea of this is to get the MySQLi commands in your head. So this is just going to be a very simple sign-up form where you're going to ask for an email and a password. And then when they submit the form, check that the email and password have been entered. Then check that the email address is not already registered, and if all of that's okay, sign the user up, i.e. put them into your database. It doesn't have to look pretty. We're not using Bootstrap or anything here. We just want something that works. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. Let's give it a shot. So I'm going to have a form with a method of post. You could use get, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially when passwords are involved. And then in this form, we're going to have an input with a name of email, and we'll give it a placeholder of email address. Then we'll have another input with a name of password and a type of password and a placeholder of password. And actually, we should probably have a type for the first one as well. It's going to be text, which is the default type, but it's always good to have types for all of your inputs. And then finally, we'll have input with a type of submit and a value of sign up. All right, simple as that. Let's have a look. Oh, forgot that we were viewing the source there. Let's go back and actually view the database itself. Excellent. So there's email and password. You can see LastPass is trying to predict things for me, but I'll just ignore that. All right. Let's now check at the beginning of our script if we have some post variables, and we're going to do that using the function that we saw before, array key exists, and we're looking for the key email in the array post. And we'll add in an OR to see if they've entered a password. It's pretty unlikely that they will just enter a password, but it is possible. And I think I'll just do a print R if that is the case, just to check. There we go. So we've got our email and our password. And then we'll check to see if the email address and password fields actually have values, i.e. the user has typed something in. So we'll check to see if email is empty. And if it is, we'll echo that the email address is required. Like that. And if it's not, that means that we have an email address. So let's just check for a password. And if that's not there, then we'll tell them, that the password is required. All right, so let's take a look at that. If I now put an email address, it tells me that the password's required. If I put in a password, it tells me that the email address is required. If I put in both, it does nothing, which is great. Okay, so now we want to check to see if the user exists in our database or not. That's the third and final error that we might see. So let's start off with our query. And we want to select, and let's just select ID from the database, because it'll be more efficient because we don't need everything else. We just need something to tell us whether or not that item is already there. And we want to select it from the users table, where the email address is equal to, and this is where we need our MySQL I real escape string. And we want to escape the email address that they've entered, and then close that and end our query. All right. If you did manage to succeed with this challenge, but you didn't put that in, then a small slap on the wrist for you, because your form was very insecure and open to SQL injections. Oops, and let's not forget to put our link in there as well. And then we run our query. So this is going to be MySQL I query, and we want to send the database link and the query itself. And then we want to check if there's any results in this query. So one way to do that would be to fetch the results as we did before. But I just want to show you one more way that we can do that, which is slightly more efficient. We can use MySQL I and then num rows and result. And this will return the number of rows in the result without actually having to get all the rows themselves. So efficiency is not particularly important in a tiny setup like this, but if you've got a massive website that people are logging into all the time, it does make all the difference. So we should try and be efficient where we possibly can. So if we check to see if the number of rows is greater than 0, then if it is, we'll say to the user that email address has already been taken. All right, hope that makes sense. Let's take a look. So I'm going to put in an email address that has already been taken, robpercival80@gmail.com, put in a password, and then sign up. So that email address has already been taken. Fantastic. If I put in one that hasn't been taken yet and a password, we should not get that error. Wonderful. All right, so the final thing to do then is to actually sign the user up if they've been successful. So we'll do that, of course, with another query. And here we're going to insert into the users table, and the columns that we're going to provide are email and password, and the values that we're going to give for them are I'm just going to copy this bit here. So MySQL I real estate string with the link and the email. So that's the email address. And then something very similar for the password. And we'll just close those parentheses there and then end our command. And then we want to run that query. So that'll be MySQL I query, link, comma, query. And we'll do a quick check here to see if that's been successful. If it has, we'll echo, you have been signed up. And if not, for now, we'll just say there was a problem signing you up. Please try again later. So that, of course, should never happen, but it's always good to check and make sure that everything has worked in the way that you think it has. So let's just try submitting that one more time. Oh, got an error on line 34. Ah, yes, because we're not actually running the query here. I don't need a closed parentheses. I just need to close the string. All right, we'll try that once more. And there we go. You have been signed up. And we may well have been logged out of PHPMyAdmin now, but let's have a quick look. Yep, we have. So we'll log back in using the password that we're using in our script. And we should see, there we go. We've got a new email address with a password. So one quick note about passwords. As I mentioned before, we should never have our passwords like this in just plain text. And in a couple of videos time, I'll show you the good way to store passwords in your database. Before that though, I want to show you two ways of actually logging users in or signing them up, because it's all well and good to tell them they've been signed up and then put onto a database, but then they're going to click on another link, and we want a way to know on that new link that this user is logged in, and we should show them some information about their account or whatever it is. And there are two primary ways to do that: sessions and cookies. And we're going to look at both of those in the next two videos. So now we know how to create a sign up form and save the user's data on our database. We need to have a way of actually keeping them signed into our website so that we know who they are and can show them the right information. And one way to do that is with session variables. So I'm actually going to do that on a new PHP file for reasons that I'll show you later on. So let's create a file called session.php. And then I'll use Command O or Control O on Windows to open it in my text editor. And then we'll just change the URL here to session.php. And I'll do a quick test to make sure everything's connected up. There we go. Great. So to use session variables, we first have to start our session. And we do that using session_start. Simple enough. And then to use the session variables, we do it in exactly the same way as with get and post. So if I wanted to set up session username, for example, I might do something like that and then set it equal to Rob Percival. So now I've created a session variable. So what's special about that? Well, the great thing about it is that this session variable will remain live while the user is browsing our website, as long as they don't shut down their browser. So what I mean by that is, if I echo the session variable username, then obviously first time I do it, it comes up with Rob Percival. There we go. But the great thing is, if I now take out that line and run the code again, it still knows what that username variable is. So this is a great way of keeping a user essentially logged in, because at the beginning of each of your scripts you can check to see if there's a session variable for username, and if it is, then show the username the logged in page. If not, then you'll probably show them a login or a sign up page. One quick thing to note is that you can use session variables on different pages of your website, but you need to have session start at the beginning of each page. If you load a page on your site without session start, then that will lose the session. It's also a good idea to avoid putting any HTML code before you start your session, because that can break your session as well. All right, so let's close that down for a moment and let's go back to our index.php file over here, and let's start our session here as well. And then let's just make sure that we can access that username variable. And there you go, you can see that we can. So that's a completely different script on our server, but we've still got the session variable. All right, So that's great. To give you a bit more of an idea about how we might use this in practice, I'm going to change our script so that when the user is signed up, it doesn't just sign them up, but it adds their email address as a session variable and then redirects them to a second page, which then would show them some information about their new account. So we can do that pretty easily. We'll just set session email equal to the email address that they signed up with. And then we'll do the redirect, which we do by setting a header. And that header is a new location. And the location is the location of the script that we want to send them. I'm going to send them to my session.php file. So we'll just call it session.php. So now this will add them into the database and then add their email to a session variable and then redirect them to our new logged in page. So now this is the challenge bit for you. We're now editing session.php. What I want you to do is check to see if there is a session email variable. And if there is, show them a bit of text like you are logged in. And if not, redirect them back to the initial login page. So if they are logged in, show them any kind of login text. And if they're not, redirect them back to the page with the login form. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. That was quite a tricky one. But we could do something like if session email exists, then echo you are logged in. And obviously what we would actually do in reality is show them the homepage for our app or whatever it was. And if not, so if they're trying to go to the logged in page, but they're not logged in, then we're going to redirect them using header and then location. And we want to send them back to index.php. All right, so we've got two scripts working together there. Let's see if we can make them work. I do still have my session username there. I'm just going to get rid of that to avoid any confusion. There we go. So let's sign up with a new email address. I'll use rob@me.com. Put in a random password and then click sign up. So now, there we go. It's saying you are logged in, and that's actually on a completely new page on our site. So what we've done there is pretty powerful. We've said that as long as the user doesn't close their browser down, they can navigate from one page to another on our site, and our site will know who they are and that they are logged in. So we've essentially got a login system up and running. So that's pretty good. But what if you want your user sessions to be a bit more persistent? You want them to continue even if the user shuts down their browser and comes back a few days later. Well, for that, we use cookies, and I'll show you how they work in the next video. Now that we know with sessions, we can store a variable that lasts as long as the user has our website open in their browser. This is pretty good, but sometimes we might want to keep them logged in for longer, and for that, we would use cookies. Now, cookies have got themselves a bit of a bad reputation, mostly because they're often used to track users as they go around the web, but we'll be using them for a completely legitimate purpose of keeping our users logged into our website after they've closed the browser. So let's see how we use cookies in PHP. I'm going to go back to our index.php and get rid of all of this, as we won't be using it again. So with cookies, they work quite differently to sessions. We don't need to start a cookie session or anything like that. We just use the set cookie function to create a cookie. And then we give the cookie a variable name. So that might be something like customer ID. And then we give it a value. So that might be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the difference between a session variable is that with a cookie, we need to give an expiry date. So that can be any time in the future. And the usual way to do this is to use the time command to get the current time on the server. And that will return a big number in seconds. And then we just add to that the number of seconds that we want it to last. So if we want our cookie to last 24 hours, for example, then we'd take 60 seconds multiplied by 60. So that gives us the number of seconds in an hour, and then 24 hours. So that cookie would expire in a day's time. If we want to keep it there for 5 days, we'd multiply that by 5. If we wanted to keep it there for a year, then we'd multiply by 365. So let's keep our cookie down to a day for now. And once we've set our cookie, we can access it in the usual way. So we'd use something like cookie to get the cookie array, and then customer ID. So let's have a look. And there we go. So you can see we've got the cookie value. And of course, if we comment out the cookie, we can still use it there. And if I shut down that browser tab completely, open up a new one and find my page, the cookie value will still be there. And that's pretty much all there is to it, except I do want to show you how to remove a cookie when necessary. So if the user logs out of your website, you're going to want to delete that cookie permanently. And there's a slightly counterintuitive way of doing that. And what you do is you set cookie again with the same name. And it really doesn't matter what value you put here, but for reasons that I'll explain in a minute, it's best to put an empty string for the value. And then you just put a time in the past. So it can be any time in the past, but I normally use an hour in the past just to be sure. And that's it. So that will essentially unset the cookie, but it will only unset it on the next load of the page. So be aware of that. You can see it's still displayed the cookie, even though we've officially got rid of it there. But if we run that script again, then you can see it doesn't exist. That customer ID is undefined. So bear in mind that when you remove a cookie like that, it doesn't remove until the next page load. And you will have noticed as well that it still gave the value of 1, 2, 3, 4, not an empty value. So this empty string just reminds us that we're not actually updating the value of the cookie. We're not actually changing it at all. We're just changing the time that it expires. So if you want to update the value of the cookie, then you would just use it in the normal way. So let's change it to test, and let's create our cookie in the future. And if we now do that, you can see that we've updated the value there. So to update the value of the cookie, you just do that in the way that you would a get or a post or any array variable. And that will update immediately. But if you want to get rid of it, then you set it in the past. But bear in mind, it'll take 2 refreshes of the page for it to disappear. There we go. So that's how to work with cookies. We've now just got one more video to go before we begin our big PHP and MySQL project, the Secret Diary web app. And in this last video, I'll show you how to store your users' passwords securely. All right, so now that we've figured out how to log our user in using both sessions and cookies, there's one more thing that we need to understand before we make our first website using a login system, our Secret Diary project, and that is how to store users' passwords securely. Now, this is quite a complex topic, and what I'm going to tell you here is definitely not everything that there is to know about website security, but it's everything you need to get your users' passwords as secure as they can be. So let's first off see how we're doing things at the moment and realize why that's such a bad idea. So at the moment in our system, our password is just stored as plain text. So that's perfectly fine from a user's point of view. We can just log them in, test their password against the one that they've entered, and we'll get them in. But if someone gets access to our database, then obviously they can just access all of our user accounts. That's pretty bad, but it's even worse that most people use the same password for a number of different websites. So not only could they access your user's account on your website, but they might well be able to access their PayPal, their Twitter account, and many worse websites besides. So we need to encrypt the password in some way. But that encryption has to work in such a way that when the user enters their password, we can still test what they've entered against the encryption that we have stored. So there is a process designed specifically for this, and this is known as creating a hash for a particular string. And there's one well-established type of hash that we normally use in PHP, and that is MD5. And the MD5 function essentially takes a string. So let's say our user has a very bad password and does a one-way encryption on it. So it essentially turns it into a long alphanumeric string that is very hard to reverse encrypt. But given the initial string, it's the same output every time. So if we stored this in our database, then when the user tried to log in, we could MD5 it and then check that against our database, and we would then know that the user had the password correct. So this is known as one-way encryption because it's easy to go one way, and this result is unique for that word, but it's hard to go the other way. So you might think we're done, right? We can just store the MD5 hash of our users' passwords in our database and no one can go the other way. Unfortunately not. Because the MD5 string is unique to each original string, hackers can quite easily create long lists of MD5s for commonly used passwords. And you can actually check this for yourself online using a website such as crackstation.net. So if we take our long string here, paste it into crackstation.net, put in the captcha, then it will check that hash against its known hashes, and you can see it's got the password straight away. So that's the problem. Because this is a unique one-way hash, common passwords will be detectable by your hackers, and we don't want that. Note that if we do have a properly complex password, something like that, and I then save that and apply MD5 to that, then this will be secure. So anyone who has a good password in your database, will still be secured with this method because it won't be on a pre-created list. But that's not good enough for us. We want even the people who have weak passwords to be able to feel secure with our system. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, you could think of this as level 2 encryption. It's definitely better than not encrypting at all, but it's not the best we can do. So how might we get to level 3? Well, level 3 encryption adds something known as a salt. And that is essentially a long string of usually numbers and letters, but it could contain anything, which then we put in front of the password each time. And what we're effectively doing there is turning a weak password into a strong one. And then, if we see what the MD5 result of that is, and we attempt to crack that, it should fail. There we go. So this is pretty good and definitely better than level 2, but we're not quite there yet, because especially if you've got a large number of users, then it's possible for the hacker to get hold of that salt somehow and then work out the MD5s for that salt and commonly used passwords, and that would still enable them to decrypt the commonly used passwords. So what's our final top level 4 encryption? Well, what we do is we have a different salt for every item in the database. And that's actually quite easy to create. We can use something like the ID for that particular row. So let's imagine that we've got a row ID of 73. We can then MD5 the row ID and use that as a salt. And then because we've got a different salt for every user in our database, it's still not 100% impossible for the hacker to get hold of one of the salts. But if they do, that doesn't give them access to any of the other passwords, and they have to start from scratch with each user. So essentially it will be such a long and complicated process that it's probably not worth it for the hacker to try and decode even commonly used passwords if you do it this way. The other advantage of doing it this way is that you don't even need to store your hash anywhere, because it's just calculated from something in your database. One extra point to bear in mind is that you should make sure that you use something absolutely static for your variable salt here, that is static per user. So don't use the user's email address, for example, because they might change their email address. And if they do, then your hashing system will break, or at least you'll have to update the password with the new hash with a new email address. So better to use something absolutely fixed, like the ID number. So there we go. This is our secure as we can possibly manage way of storing passwords. And we're now ready to build our complete login system for our secret diary website. We'll do that in the next video. Congratulations on making it to the end of the MySQL section of the Complete Web Developer course. You've covered a huge amount, and we've been working steadily towards creating our own web app with a completely functional login system. And that's what we're going to be doing in this challenge. So I've split it into 2 parts, and I'm first going to show you the final output of what we're going to be making, and then I'll show you what we're aiming for in this first video. So obviously we've got a nice looking Bootstrap styled page, and we can switch between sign up and login by clicking the link at the bottom there. If we try and sign up without a password or something like that, we get nice error messages. And once we do sign up, I'll just use a random email address, we are treated to a lovely big text area where the user can enter their deepest thoughts, and they're updated in the database as soon as the user has typed them. So they don't even need to click a save button. And then of course the user can log out and come back to the home page. So that's what we're going to be producing. It's pretty cool, but what we're after in this first video is something a lot less pretty, but not necessarily a lot less functional. So what I want to do here is kind of abstract the login system. So we've got a sign up form and a login form, both of which have an option to stay logged in, which is going to create a cookie to keep the user logged in permanently, even if they shut down the browser. And this has got all of the same validation built in, but when you sign up or log in successfully, it just logs you into a page that says you are logged in and gives them the option to log out. So the reason I've separated it is because this will give you a robust and flexible login system that you could use for pretty much any site that required user sign up. So you've got all the skills to do this yourself. I hope it goes well. Go for it. All right then, here goes. I'm going to begin by making the HTML sign up form, And this is going to be pretty similar to the form that we made a few videos ago, with the exception that we're also going to allow the user to stay logged in using a cookie. So here goes. We're going to have a form, and I'm going to stick with post. And then I'm going to have an input with a type of email. It's going to have a name of email as well, and a placeholder of your email. Then we'll have similar for the password. So type of password, name equals password, and placeholder. Let's just have password. And then we're going to have a checkbox with a name of stay logged in and a value of 1. And finally, we're going to have an input with a type of submit and a value of sign up. All right, let's take a look. Whoop, that's fine, except don't know what I'm doing with my checkbox. Should have been an input with a type of checkbox. Let's just try that again. Great. Obviously, we'll add the labels for these later on. But for now, let's just do a quick test. Sign up, so it seems to be submitting the form well. And then let's just add some PHP to test first off if there is a post variable. So if array key exists, and one way around looking for the email or password is to actually look for the submit, which if they click on that button to submit the form, which they have to submit the form, there's definitely going to be a submit variable in there. So we could actually look for array key exists and look for the submit key within the post array. And if that does exist, for now, we'll just display the post values. So let's just fill those in again. And there we go. So we've got email, we've got password, stay logged in, and submit. Excellent. So let's do some validation. We'll have an error variable, which is initially empty, and then if they haven't entered an email address, we'll append to the error an email address is required. And we'll do the same for password. And I'm not going to do any email validation to check that it's a valid email, or I'm not going to have multiple password fields to check against each other as well. Just for simplicity, we've done those before and you can add those if you like. So then we'll say if there is an error, i.e. the error string is not empty, then we'll say something like error equals there were errors in your form and then we'll have the specific error messages. And I'll just pop a line break again at the end of each of those. Not that it's really needed at the end of the password, but we might want to add further ones on, and it's not going to break anything. So then down here, as we've seen before, we'll have a div with an ID of error, and we'll echo the error message there, which will obviously be blank if there isn't one. Okay, so let's try putting just an email address in. Oh, it does have to be valid. Oh, yep, that's very strange of me. I changed error to password for some reason. Try that again. Excellent. There are errors in your form, a password is required. And similarly, if I put a password in, then we get an email address error. If I put an email address in and a password, then we don't get any errors. Brilliant. All right, so if there isn't an error, our next step is to see if that email address is taken. And for that, we'll need access to our database. So I've got my control panel up and ready to go here. I'm going to create a new database because we're doing everything from scratch. So I'm clicking on MySQL databases, and I'm going to call it secret DI. And notice that you're limited to 9 characters here. So I'm just going to leave it as that. If you're using a different system, you may be able to have a longer name, but it doesn't really require one, so that will work fine. And then we'll generate a password and create the database. Great. So then let's scroll down to get the details. There we go. That's what we're going to need to connect. But first off, let's jump into phpMyAdmin and create the data structure. So I'd always recommend using something like phpMyAdmin to manage your database. So when you're actually creating tables or columns, then do that in a nice interface like this, and then use your code to just add and edit and search items within your database as necessary. So we'll just call it users again. And I'm going to have 5 columns. I never know quite how many columns I'm going to need, but 5 seems reasonable. And if you don't use them all, then that's fine anyway. So I'm going to start as always with an ID. That's an integer, and it's going to auto increment, and it's going to be a primary key. Then I'm going to have the email address. I'm going to have my password, and I'm going to have my diary. So that's going to be the actual content of the diary, which we obviously won't need until later on, but we'll put it in now anyway. And those two will be text. I think that's all we'll need. We'll find out later on. Okay, so now if we look at that, obviously there's no users in there as yet. So now it's time to connect to our database from our script. So we'll do that here. So we'll have a link, which is going to be MySQLi connect. And we're on the same server as our database server, so I can use localhost. If we weren't, I would have to use that IP address there. Then we have the username. For our database. Then we're going to have the password, but while I've got it in my clipboard, remember on Eco Web Hosting, the database name is the same as the username. So I'm going to paste that in there as well. And then we can grab the password and put that in there too. Then we'll do our check to see if there is a MySQLi connect error. And if there is, then we'll end the script and we'll just put a database connection error. All right, with any luck though, we'll be connected to the database, and then when we're here, we can do our check to see if there is a user with the email address that our new user has entered. So let's set up a query. It's going to be select ID from users, where email is equal to, and then we're going to use MySQL I real escape string, and then the post email variable, so that you'll remember escapes any strange characters and any naughtiness that the user might be using to access our system. And I'll pop a limit on there. Not that it really matters, but I like to have a limit unless it's really not necessary. Then we'll run the query. So result is MySQL I query using the link and the query. And using link there just has reminded me that I've forgotten to put it in there for the MySQL I real escape string as well. Then I'm going to check MySQL I num rows, as we saw before, from the result. And I want to see if that is bigger than 0. And if it is, we'll echo that email address is taken. Or in fact, let's not echo it. Let's set our error variable equal to it, and then it will be echoed down there. And if that's not the case, we actually want to sign the user up. So let's run our query. This is going to be insert into users, and we're inserting 2 fields, email and password, and the values for those fields are going to be the email address, which we've already got escaped right there, and also the password, which remember we're going to hash, but I want to hash it with the ID of the user in the database, and we don't know what that is yet. So I'm going to very temporarily store the password unhashed, and then we'll immediately update it. Okay, and then we'll run that query. And just before we do the updating the password bit, I'm just going to run this because I've written a lot of code there. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some errors in it. So let's have a look while we're still working. Ah, yes. I often forget my link. And actually, let's add a check to see if that's worked. I think I'll check specifically if it hasn't worked. Then we'll add an error. Could not sign you up. Please try again later. And for now, let's have a quick echo sign up. Successful. So that's what we want to see. Let's have a look. All right, we've got something that looks very promising there. Let's have a look in the database. Hurrah! We have our new user. Fabulous. So now then, if the user tries to sign up again with those details, it should say that email address is taken. So the next thing to do then is update the password to a properly hashed password. And to do that, we'll need the ID of the inserted row, which we could get by doing a query from it. But there's actually a really nice way of getting that ID, and that is using MySQL insert ID. And that actually gives us the ID of the most recently inserted element in our database, which is really handy. So that's going to give us what we need. So that means I want to update the password using an MD5 hash involving this. So let's set up our query. And we want to update, I'll just get rid of that for the moment, update users. And we want to set password equal to, and we want to do an MD5 of the posted password. But you'll remember we want to salt that with an MD5 of the MySQL insert ID. So this will take the MySQL insert ID, so the ID of the row that we've just created. It will MD5 it. It will then append that to the password that they've put in. It'll MD5 that, and then it will set that to be the password for our user. And we want to set that to be the case where the ID is equal to, and again, we want MySQL insert ID. We could stop there, but I'm going to pop a limit 1 on the end just in case something goes horribly wrong. All right, then once again, we'll run the query. So link and query, and then that should encode the password for us. So let's have a new user at gmail.com with some password, and then we'll sign them up. Aha, we've got a good warning there. The MySQL insert ID does require the link variable to go in there. So let's have another new user at Gmail with a very simple password. Okay, we've got sign up successful. That's looking good. Let's now have a look at our database, and we should find, there we go. So our other new user has a nicely hashed password in there, and let's get rid of these unsecure ones because they're dirtying our database as it stands. We don't want that. All right. So now we're going to set up the sessions and, if requested, the cookie. So let's start by adding session start to the beginning of our script. And then we'll set the session ID to be equal to, again, MySQL insert ID. So the ID of our new user. And finally, we'll check to see if they have requested to stay logged in. And that will be the case if stay logged in is equal to 1. And if it is, then we'll set a cookie as well. So that's going to be ID. It's going to have a value of MySQL insert ID link. And a time of the current time plus 1 minute, then an hour, 24, and why not go for the whole hog, 365. So that will really keep them logged in for a long time. All right, so now we've set the session and the cookie, we're going to do a redirect. So I'm just going to nip back to FireFTP and create a new file. And this is going to be logged in page.php. We're only going to have one logged in page, so I can just call it that, but you're going to probably want to be a little bit more descriptive with your file names. So logged in page, we're then going to edit. And this is going to be pretty simple. So we're going to start our session. And we're going to check to see if there's a cookie. So I'll do it using array key exists. And the key that we're looking for is ID. And we're looking for it in the cookie array. And if that's the case, then we'll set the session ID equal to the cookie ID. So that's a pretty simple way to have a session and cookie set up in one go. So if the user has a cookie, then we update the session to equal it, and then we can refer to the session everywhere else. And essentially we just recreate the session every time that we need to. And then we'll check to see if there's a session. So again, if array key exists, and this time we're looking for the same key, but we're looking in the session array. So if that's the case, we'll echo logged in, and we'll give them a link to log out. And the way I'm going to do this is to link back to index.php, but with a flag saying logout is equal to 1. So that's a get variable, which essentially says log me out. And we'll deal with that back in index.php. So that will be our logout link. And we'll have a paragraph there as well. Okay, so that's if they are logged in. If they're not logged in, I'm just going to redirect them back to the home page. And we do that with a header of location index.php. Okay. So let's check first off that the redirect works when they're logged out. So if we run to logged in page.php, it should, there we go, link us straight back to index.php, which has acquired a warning. We'll deal with that in a minute. And then hopefully, if we're logged in when we get to that page, it will show us the logged in and then give us the logged out link. So let's save that and close that down for now. I use just Command W or Control W on Windows to close that. And let's have a quick look at this error. So we want to, yes. As we saw before, we want to create the error variable before we check for a post variable. Okay. So instead of saying sign up successful, we now want to link them or redirect them to the logged in page. Wonderful. So let's sign up rob@rob.com and we'll try a permanent sign up, see how that goes. There we go. So we've redirected and it clearly knows that we're logged in because it's displaying the logged in message. So let's click log out, and excellent. That links us back to the home page with logout is equal to 1. So all that remains for that bit is to log the user out, and we'll do this right here. So if array key exists, and then we're looking for the logout key. Just going to check that. Yep. The logout key within the get array. And if that exists, then we want to log the user out. So we'll unset the session. We'll set the cookie into the past. So time minus 60 times 60. And I like to just set the cookie to an empty string just in case it gets accessed later on. Not that it should. Remember, it takes an extra refresh for the cookie variable to actually be destroyed. And then we'll add in here that if they're not logging out, we'll have a check to see if they are logged in, because we don't want them seeing the login form if they're already logged in. So if array key exists ID session, or array key exists ID cookie, then we'll redirect them to the logged in page. All right, so if we sign up now, with a cookie, then we redirect over to the logged in page. If we attempt to go back to the home page, then it just redirects us back to the logged in page. But if we log out, then we're now properly logged out and it doesn't do the redirect. Brilliant. So this is now set up more or less as we want. The one thing that we're missing is a login form. So let's add that down here. So it's going to look very much like the sign up form, and it's going to behave very much like it as well. The difference is we're going to have a login value instead of sign up. There we go. Now, one thing we're going to need to do up here when we're doing our post is to know whether we're attempting to sign the user up or log them in. Now, one way we could do it is to look at the value of the submit variable, but that's not very neat because we might want to change the word sign up to register or something like that, and we don't want to have to update our code to take account of a change in the look of the website. So the way I'm going to work with that is to have a hidden variable, which is just an input that doesn't display on the HTML at all, but we can use it in our code. So that's going to have a name of sign up and a value of 1. And then down here, we're going to have exactly the same thing, but sign up is going to have a value of 0 because we're logging in. Okay, so let's see what we need to change for logging in then. We still want to do the database connection, obviously. We still want to check to see if there's an email. We still want to check if there's a password. So we can leave those parts in. But this part here is going to be different. So I'm going to split this all up. So we're now checking to see if post sign up, just make sure I've spelled that right. Yep. Is equal to 1. Then we're going to do all of this sign up stuff. And just make that a bit bigger so we can see what's going on. And you can see we've got a handy green marker there. So that's the end of the sign up section. So I'm going to put that there and else. And for now, I'll just put logging in because I want to check that I've done that correctly. So that should do all of this if it's a sign up, and if not, we'll get a message saying logging in. Okay, I think that's probably because I've put this in the wrong place. I think it should probably be there. 1 curly brackets down. There we go, easily done. So let's first off just check that the form validation is working on the login. Excellent, yep, that's looking promising. Great. And then let's do a full login. Great. So it's going to the right bit of the script. And let's just make sure that we've got the variables that we need. I'll just get last pass out the way. Let's resubmit that. Great. So we've got our email and we've got our password. So we're going to need to do a query to see if the user's got their username and password correct. So let's set up a query. So we want to select ID from our users table where, and we want email to be equal to MySQL real escape string. Don't forget the link and the posted email. And that's it for now. Note we can't check the password at this point because we don't know the ID of the user, and therefore we don't know the salt to our password hashing. So we need to get the email, check the email first, and then let's get the query. Using link and query. And then we'll set row equal to MySQL fetch array of the result. And then we're checking to see if the array key exists, and that's the ID field in the row array. And if it does, we'll create a variable called hashed password, which is going to be MD5. And then we're going to MD5 the row ID, combine that with the password that the user has entered, and that will be our entered hash password. And in fact, I'm going to change that to a select star, select everything, because then we can just check if hashed password is equal to the saved password in the database. So if it is, then we want to set the session ID to the row ID. And we also want to set the cookie if necessary and redirect. Now, I probably should put that in a separate function because I'm using it twice, but I'm going to be a bit lazy here. We've got a lot of new stuff, and I think it's probably slightly simpler to just have this code twice for now. So if stayed login is equal to 1, then we'll set the ID of the cookie not to MySQL insert ID, but the row ID. And then we'll do the redirect. All right, so there was quite a lot of new stuff there. Let's hope I haven't broken anything. Oh, the script still works at least. So let's sign up first. So we'll have asdf@asdf.com and a password of asdf. Sign up, that still works, great. Then we'll log out and then we'll log in with the same details. Excellent. So that login has worked. Let's just make sure that if we log in with an incorrect email address, for example, that should not work. Well, it hasn't worked, which is good, but we do have a warning. So let's just fix that. Line 95, let's have a look. Okay. So because the row array doesn't exist, checking for a key within it doesn't really make sense. So let's use if is set instead. And that will check to see if the row array exists at all. And that then should avoid that message, which it does. But that has reminded me that we have to add an error message in to say if it doesn't, we'll set the error to that email/password combination could not be found. And don't forget the semicolon. Let's resubmit. Excellent. And if we get the email address right, but the password wrong, then, okay, it doesn't log us in, which is good, but we don't have an error message. So that should go there. And again, I don't quite like having that message twice. But I think putting in the code to combine it into one is not quite worth it. And will just make this rather unnecessarily more complicated than it needs to be. So let's just check. We now have our error message. Fantastic. So that's as far as I'm going to go in this video. What you now have here is a solid and secure sign-in system that you can use on any website. There's nothing specific to Secret Diary other than the database name. And that, of course, you would change anyway. So it's a really good general purpose bit of code, and it forms a solid basis for our Secret Diary web app as well. All right, so we'll stop there, but we'll carry straight on with our Secret Diary web app in the next video. Actually, just before we move on, there is one thing that I want to clarify here, and one issue that we've got with the setup as it stands, and that is if we log ourselves in. So let's just create a new account and then log out. That all works fine. But if we then go back to index.php without the logout get variable, then it actually still thinks we're logged in. And that's because of the delay of unsetting the session and setting the cookie backwards as well. So the array key exists even though the actual variable itself doesn't have a value, or its value is 0. So I'm going to fix that by adding an extra couple of bits to the if statement, because what I want to avoid doing is just, if I get rid of that temporarily, I want to avoid doing that, because even though that will work, it will give me a PHP warning, and I want to avoid the warnings, because if that doesn't exist, then I'm assuming that it exists by doing this, by doing the check on it. So what I'm going to do is check for both the array key existing and the ID actually having a value, or the cookie existing and the cookie having a value. And that gets around the problem, because if the array key for the session variable doesn't exist, then it won't do the check on session ID, so we won't get an error. And similarly for the cookie, if the array key doesn't exist, it won't do the check on the cookie itself. So that avoids the false redirect problem, but without giving us a PHP warning. So now you can see we're not being redirected. All right, on with the secret diary. So now that we've built our login and sign up system, let me just give you a quick reminder of what we're working towards. So in this video, we'll be obviously prettifying things quite a bit using Bootstrap and getting a nice background image in there. We're going to be using a little bit of jQuery to switch between login and sign up forms. And then when the user does sign up, we're going to jump them over to our secret diary page, which will look like this. And then they can type whatever they like, and it will get updated immediately in the database. There we go. And of course, the user will be able to log out clicking the button at the top. So that's what we're after. Let's get cracking. Okay then, here we go. I'm going to start, of course, by jumping over to Bootstrap. I'm getting our starter template. So our usual route to getting started, which may be slightly different for you if the website has updated, but what we want is this starter template. And then we're going to put all of this beneath our PHP. And I'll pop the form into it now. There we go. So this is going to be a similar process to when we made the What's the Weather app before. So we'll have a class of container, and then we'll have an h1 of secret diary. Then we'll put in our forms. We'll make those pretty later on. And then, well, let's have a quick look at that before we do anything else. Great. So you can see that's what happens if you don't apply the Bootstrap form stylings. So let's do those next. Remember, the form is a component. And then click forms. And I'm not going to copy and paste the whole thing this time, but I'm just going to remind myself, right, so we need field sets around the inputs. And then we're going to end the field set there. So let's put all of these in first. So field sets there. And then we'll close the field set. Then the inputs go inside the field sets. There we go. And then the same for the second form. And then we'll close that final field set. And let's indent everything. Okay, and then we need to give our inputs a class of form control. Accept the submit, which is going to have a type of button, and I'll go for button success. So a nice green button. And then similarly up here. All right, let's have a look. Okay, looking quite a bit nicer. All right, let's add a bit of text to our checkbox. So I'll just add stay logged in. There, and that will create the cookie if they tick the box. Let's have a look. Okay, that's not quite what we need. So let's just take a look. There's probably some special code that we need for the checkbox. Okay, so we need a div with a class of checkbox and then a label for that one. So let's get rid of our field set for the checkbox and add in the div. There's our label. Stay logged in, and then we'll close the label and close the div, and then we're not using the field set at all. Okay, let's just have a look, make sure that works. Okay, it's still a bit lower down. Let's get rid of the line break, see if that does the trick. Nope, so something's gone wrong. Notice the checkbox doesn't actually have a form control class. That's probably what's causing the problem. There we go, that's better. So let's now do the same thing for our other form. And close the label, close the div, get rid of the close field set. And of course the form control class. Great. So already looking a lot nicer. Let's center everything inside our container div. Been enthusiastic with my styles there. So we might be able to use just text align equals center Let's have a look to see if that makes everything a bit crazy wide. I think it does. So let's give it a width of, say, 400 pixels. Great. Okay, the last bit of styling I'm going to do before we get rid of the login form initially and allow the user to toggle between the two is a nice background image. So we'll go over to unsplash.com, and this time I know a little bit more about what I want, so I'm going to do a search for nature because I want a nice, clean, simple nature image which will inspire people to write in their diary. I think I like that one. So it's got a kind of solitary feel to it. So let's click there and save image as. And I'm going to save it into my MySQL folder. As background. And then I suspect I'm going to need to resize it. So let's have a look. Yep, 4.7 megabytes is a lot more than we need. So I'm just going to double click and then Tools, Adjust Size. And we'll go for a width of 2000, which is absolutely plenty. And then save. It's still pretty large. I would definitely make that smaller if this was going to be a production site, but it will do for us. Then back over to Firefox with FireFTP, and then let's just drag out the folder contents there. We'll do a quick refresh. There's background.jpg. So let's upload it. Wonderful. So just to check as before that everything's connected and working, let's pop the image into our container div directly. So it was background dot, and then let's just check background.jpg without an E this time. And let's have a look. Great, it's there. Now our next challenge is to get it full screen and stretched. So in fact, we could do a CSS full page background Google, but I've still got the page that we found when we did that last time. So I'm just going to grab the CSS that we know works, pop it in there, let's get some nice indenting. And then change the background image to background.jpg. Then we'll get rid of the other image tag. Take a look. Okay, that's good. We just need to get rid of the background on everything except our HTML element. There we go. Brilliant. So obviously we need to work on the vertical positioning a little. Let's for now give it a margin top of 200 pixels just to move it down a little too much, I think. 150. Great. Okay, so now we need to deal with the fact that we've got two login or sign up forms displaying at the same time, which is definitely not what we want. So first, I'm going to give them both an ID so that we can refer to them. So the ID for this one is going to be sign up form. And the ID for this one is going to be login form. And the crucial thing about login form is that it's going to be hidden. There we go. So let's add some text to the bottom of the sign up form to allow the user to log in if they want to. So we'll just have a paragraph and then we'll just have a link with no href but an ID of show log in form, and the text can be login. There we go. Then we can have a bit of jQuery at the bottom, and we want this to be called when the login button is clicked. So we'll get it by its ID. That is show login form. So when it's clicked, we want a function to run. And I like to do a test to make sure that my jQuery is all connected up right before I try and do anything complicated. Excellent. That's looking good. So what I want to do here is I want to toggle each of the forms. So I want to toggle both login form and sign up form. So let's toggle sign up form first. So that will make it disappear. And then let's do the same thing for login form. Okay, so that should switch from the sign up form to the login form. Brilliant. Pretty simple. Now let's add a link to switch from the login form back to the sign up form. And you may have noticed that actually the code to do that is exactly the same. We want to toggle both of those forms. So actually we can make this a bit simpler. Instead of having this function twice, we could have a class of toggle forms. And then we can have another one here as well. Excellent. And now we should be able to switch back and forth between the forms. Brilliant. So we need to do a little bit of fixing with the layout here, and I think we could do with a little bit of explanatory text. So let's have a paragraph with some strong text in it, saying just something like, store your thoughts permanently and securely. Lovely. Do need to do something with our colors, but we'll sort that out in a minute. And then I want to add a bit of text to each of these. So for the sign up form, I'm going to add interested, sign up now. And then for the login form, we'll have login using your username and password. And then let's have a look. Excellent. So it is there, even though it's not very easy to see. So let's experiment with some coloring. So I'm going to start by just making everything white. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. The only thing I can't see very clearly is that login link. So I'm going to try playing with that. That was a toggle forms link. So let's try first off making it bold, because I'd like it to be a bit clearer anyway. Actually, I think that works pretty well. It's not quite the clearest, but it's clear enough. Let that be a lesson to you that when you're choosing background images, the most important thing is that it doesn't obscure the text or instructions that you want the user to read. All right, but we'll go just as far as that in terms of design. So let's sign up yet another account because I can't remember any of the passwords. And let's sign ourselves up. Great. So now we're over in loggedinpage.php, and most of the work for the rest of the website is going to be on this page. But before we leave our index.php behind completely, I am going to do a little bit of work to create some extra files so we don't have to contain all this code twice. So first off, I'm going to get all of this HTML and I'm going to include it in a file called header.php. Let's save that there, and then let's create it here. So header.php, open it up and paste that lot in. And then if we just check log out, everything should still work fine, but now our header code can be accessed from any other page, and we only need to edit it once. Now this code is unique to index.php, so I can leave that there, but everything from here downwards I can put in a footer file. So I'm going to call that footer.php. Okay, and let's create that file. Notice that this script is only for the home page, but it won't cause any problems on any of the other pages. So it's probably simpler to just leave it there. Okay, and the other bit of code that I want to be accessible from anywhere is the connection code, because I don't want to have the password for my database repeated throughout my website. So I'm going to get rid of that and include that as a file called connection.php. So let's then create that. Open it up, and because this one has PHP code, I need to put the PHP tags back in. And then I can save that as it is. And just to check that everything still works as it did before, and there we go, everything's still working great. Great, so now it's just a matter of making a logged in page, and that should be pretty straightforward now that we can use the included files that we've just created. So let's start working with logged in page. And we're going to keep this set up here. But now we're going to include header.php and footer.php. And that should give us a nice looking page without doing anything to earn it. Wonderful. So our secret diary is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to have a container div and don't forget to close your PHP. And then within that, we're going to have a text area with an ID of diary. All right, there it is. Pretty simple at the moment, but let's first off give it a class of form control so it gets all the nice bootstrap stylings. There we go. And then we want to make this pretty big. So let's go over to header.php and give it some styles. So this is the diary ID. And I'm going to start with a width of 100% and a height of 100%. So let's see how that looks. Okay, not bad, but we've got a few problems there. First off is I've realized that our container here has a margin top of 150 pixels, which we don't want on our container in our second page. So let's have a new ID of homepage container, which is going to have a margin top of 150, and that should then not apply to our new container. Of course, that means we'll need to edit index.php again. So now let's give the container div here in the index.php file an ID of home page container. And then we should have the margin at the top of that one, but not at the top of this one. So let's jump back over and take a look. Great. So happy with that. Height-wise, width-wise, however, it looks like it's as wide as the container, but that's not very wide. There is an easy fix though. If you'll remember, there's a related class to container called container fluid, which stretches out to the very edge of the screen. And that's what we want here. We just want a nice big text area for people to keep their thoughts in. That kind of thing. Okay, so now we just need to update the diary field in the database with the contents of the text area when it's updated. Easy, right? Well, we've already done something fairly similar in our code player app. So let's find the code or something similar that we used there. Something like detect change in text area content. That should do it for us. Here we go. How do I bind to the change event of a text area in jQuery? Perfect. Pretty sure that's the one we used before. So we're going to put this in the footer, because that's where all our jQuery goes. And we want to do this with the diary ID. And we don't need to do any of that stuff. So for now, as usual, we'll just alert changed to see if everything is working. Great. It is indeed. So how are we going to update the database when this changes? Well, we can only update the database with a PHP script. So we're going to need to call a PHP script when this changes. And the only way we can do that is using Ajax. So let's remind ourselves how Ajax works. It's been a while. Let's, as usual, go down to the first example. Okay, this is pretty simple. So it looks like that. I'm not going to be too careful about what happens if they don't have an internet connection, etc. We saw how to work with errors in Ajax last time. So I won't go into that in too much detail this time. But we are going to need a script to do this, and we're going to need to pass the contents of our diary text area to that script. So we could either do that with a get or a post. I think a post is a little bit more exciting. We haven't done one before. So let's see if we can find a good example. Here we go. This looks perfect. So actually, yeah, let's use that one. So we're doing a post to update database.php. And we only need one variable here, and that's, I'll call it content, and that's going to be the contents of the diary text area. And we can get that using the diary and then val. So that's our Ajax. Now we need to just write update database.php. So let's save that back over to FireFTP again. Create another file, update database.php. And first off, I'll just return some text. And because this sample code that we've got alerts data saved and then message, that should alert data saved and then hi there, because it should get back what the script returns. So fingers crossed. Wonderful. So data saved hi there, and it's doing that with Ajax. Brilliant. So now we can work on our update database.php script. And the main thing that we need to do is get the post variable. So let's check that it's been passed first. Array key exists. And we called it content, and it should be in the post array. And let's put our parentheses in the right place. And so if it does, for now, let's just echo it. All right. There we go. ADA. So it's getting the contents of what we're writing. Wonderful. So all we need to do is save that to the database. So we'll need to connect to the database, which we can now do really easily using our connection.php script. And then we just need our queries. So we want to update the users table, and we want to set, let's just check what the variables were, diary, and we want to set that equal to MySQL real escape string post content. And we want to do that where the ID is equal to, and where are we going to get this ID from? Well, it's stored as a session variable. So if we start the session here, we should be able to access it. So let's use MySQL real escape string just in case, even though there's pretty much zero chance of this variable being anything other than a number. And as usual, I'll pop a limit 1 on the end there just in case. And then we'll do a check to see that that's been processed correctly via link and query. And if it has, for now, we'll just echo success, else echo failed. Okay, and let's have a look. Okay, we've got some warnings and a failure there. Oh, it's my classic error. Don't forget the link in MySQL real escape string. Success! Hurrah! And let's convince ourselves that that's true. I've probably been logged out of users now, so let's log back in. I'll get the password from connection.php. There we are. And there we go. You can see it's right there in the database. Great, so we're pretty close to being done now. Let's just get rid of the code here because we're not going to return anything to the script. We'll just leave that blank. And then we'll go back to footer.php and remove the alert. So we can get rid of the done function completely. So let's take a look. So nothing's popping up, but is it updating in the database? Fingers crossed, yes it is. Wonderful. So a couple more slight tweaks. One issue that we have is when we load the logged in page initially, the diary code doesn't display. And that's of course no good to us. So let's load the diary code at the top here. So when we know that we're logged in, we'll include connection.php, and then we'll run a query which will be select diary from users where ID equals, and then we'll have MySQL real escape string and we're using session ID, and we'll have a limit 1 there. And then we want to do the query. So that's MySQL I query, and we want to get the results of that straight away. So we can actually do that all on one line. So we could have MySQL I fetch array and then use the query directly, and we could set row equal to that, and then let's have a variable diary content, which is going to be equal to row and then diary, and then we'll just echo diary content in the middle of the text area. And just before we run that, let's pop the link in there, and we should also have an empty diary content string just in case there isn't any, so we don't get any PHP errors down here. But just before we run that, let's just add in our links, and now we should find that the saved diary content appears there. So that is really cool. If I refresh, it's all saved. Fabulous. So we're really close to being done. All that remains is this header here, which doesn't look great. So let's go back over to Bootstrap and get a nice navbar at the top there so that everything looks good. So over to documentation, components, and navbar. And then we'll just take that navbar there and put it above our container fluid div. So before we edit it, let's just check that it looks okay. Okay, that's a start, but we've got a couple of things to fix there. So first off, we no longer need our logged in, log out code at the top here, but I will be keeping that link. So I'll just borrow that for the moment. We'll change the navbar brand to secret diary. We'll get rid of all of those links, and we'll also change the navbar class to navbar fixed top. So it's all stretched out and fixed at the top. We do want to pull right here, but it's not going to be a form. So let's change that to a div. Get rid of the input. And I want to make the button a link with the href being what I just copied, so to the logout page. And then we want to change search to logout. All right, let's take a look. Okay, that's pretty good, but our text area is of course hidden behind our navbar there, so we should be able to fix that quite easily with a quick margin in our header, but we will need to give it an ID first of all, our container fluid. So this is container logged in page. Let's copy that and then open the header, and in the styles we want container logged in page. And let's give that a margin top of, let's try 70 pixels. That's a little bit too much, I think. I'm going to go for 60 instead. Perfect. And then, of course, when the user logs out, they're back to the home page. So just one small thing left to fix, and that is our error messages. So if I don't put a password in right now, of course, I get an error message, but it's not particularly nicely displayed. And of course, I want to use Bootstrap alerts to make those look a lot nicer. So let's copy the code over from there. And all of these are going to be in our index.php. And so we'll add this here. So we'll check to see if error is not an empty string. Then we'll echo all of this, but we'll want to put the error string itself in the middle of it. Okay, let's have a look. So now we should have much prettier error messages. Wonderful. Similarly, if I try and log in with something that doesn't work, we get a nice error message there as well. Wonderful. So that is as far as we're going to go on this project. There's a fair bit more that you could do with it if you wanted. One quite fun extra would be to validate the user's email address. And that's not too tricky to do. You just send them an email, as we know how to do, with a random code, which you then put into a field in the database. And then they click on a link which has that code embedded in it. And then it checks the code against the database. And if it's correct, then consider the email address validated. You could also offer different diary pages for different dates. And you could set up a password reset system, which emailed the user if they can't remember their password, and again sets up a special link via an item in the database. And then when the user clicks back on that link from their email address, they're given the opportunity to reset their password. But this is as far as we're going to go, and congratulations once again on making it to the end of the MySQL section of the course. You've done some really advanced stuff in this section, so pat yourself on the back, go have a break, and recharge before we unleash the power of Google Maps, Facebook, Twitter, and an unlimited number of other web services using APIs.